Hi, I'm Lori Siegel. I'm our technology correspondent at CNN. So thank you guys so much for coming to this today. I've been covering tech for 8 years, and I think VR is something very special and something not to be ignored. So if you guys don't mind, just tell us a little bit about who you are and what you're doing at your company as it relates to VR.
Sure. So I'm Neil Graham. I'm the executive producer of Sky VR Studios. And about 9 months ago, I was tasked with setting up a VR studio internally at Sky. And that was really with a view to looking across the Sky content estate from news to sports to arts, entertainment, working out what the uses of VR would be, establishing connections in the company to work out how we would start filming in VR and setting up the content the creation pipeline, really, and working through what would be needed and where we could go to different areas of expertise within the company and pull in the right people and the kind of VR expertise that we would need externally as well. So over the last few months, that's what we've been doing. We found a lot of new uses for VR as we've gone along the way. And in each genre, we've found that there have been 2 or 3, at least, really compelling uses for VR. And now that we've got to a stage where we feel like we know a reasonably good amount about how to produce VR and how to push it forwards, we're also going to be, the VR studio is also going to be looking at commissioning content from external content providers.
Cool, and I want to get into a little bit of that later. Jason, who also is a colleague of mine, full disclosure, talk about what you're doing at CNN.
Sure. My name is Jason Farkas. I'm the executive producer for CNN VR. And our VR effort has really got kickstarted about 1.5 years ago when we live streamed one of the first Democratic debates. It was the very first, actually, between Hillary and Bernie Sanders. And since then, we've actually moved very heavily into features production. So CNN, I think, is known for 2 things at its core. One is live news, and the other is breaking news. And so we've done the live experience. And now we're trying to find a way to sort of arm our entire news gathering operation such that they can produce 360 stories in the field for the right narratives. I think that's one of the hardest things, and I know we'll talk about that on this panel, but finding the right stories to tell in virtual reality so that it maximizes the impact it can have for really important journalistic efforts. So we actually produced a piece that I will talk about a little bit later from the Italy earthquake earlier this week. So that's just an example of how we can try to quickly bring virtual reality experiences to people around the globe who want to feel a closeness to the stories that are unfolding around the planet where there is an emotional component to be told.
Yeah, hi, I'm Yelena Rachitsky, and similar to what you just heard, trying to figure it out as well, which is fun. I'm a producer at Oculus, and I work more specifically with the experiences section, and that's everything that's kind of non-gaming. So how does VR work in film, in news, in sports, in music, and just broadening what's even possible for VR apart from the mediums that we're already familiar with. So I try to find interesting content, think about interesting content, and then also think about how we're pushing creativity in the field. So catalyzing the creative community through various initiatives, bringing VR into the universities, and yeah, that's the gist of it.
Hi, I'm Alan Tyler. I'm a commissioning editor at the BBC, and I think the themes are incredibly similar, actually, just listening to everyone else. I think, the BBC's had a long history of innovating technology in step with its audience, and I think in terms of VR, that is absolutely the critical point for us. We have to look at this, decide how we use it best right across genre, and in which way, but in step with our audience. So that means that from a BBC perspective, we're in a real phase where we're asking a lot of questions about the technology and asking a lot of questions about what it can do in terms of storytelling. So it's it feels to me like quite a critical moment, actually. Is this something that will become widespread, or is it something that might not really achieve adoption in a widespread enough way to justify its place in mainstream storytelling? And I think that's a really interesting question. It's certainly one that we're asking ourselves.
It's interesting because the industry was kind of burned by 3D TV, right? Even as a tech reporter, you hear about the hot new technology, and VR is not necessarily new, but we're hearing about it the same way we heard about 3D TV and people talking about the hype. Why, and that didn't end up working out. Why do you guys think virtual reality is different?
3D TV was not a different way of creating content. It was just making something that was 2D feel slightly cooler, but it was the same form of content that you were seeing. VR is just a completely new way of making content, of the experience you have. It's all about full immersion, whereas 2D is still something that feels separate and flat with the illusion of dimensionality.
I think it's sort of interesting one, isn't it? I think the question is about how you can change the storytelling. So does this make the story essentially different, or the experience of consuming that story essentially different? And I'm not sure. I think 3D delivers an immense treat, but I'm not sure that it changes the story in quite the same way that VR has the ability to. The question becomes about the barrier to entry, and whether or not that barrier to entry will be too high for a large part of the audience. And I don't really know that the answer to that is quite clear yet, but I do agree, I think it's different to the 3D proposition.
I think there's also something about the experience of it. So I worked on some of Sky's early 3D programming, and the reaction to showing people, putting glasses on and showing them was like, oh, wow, that's amazing, that looks great. With virtual reality, the reaction to showing the first horror piece I showed to my wife, she couldn't cope with it. She threw the headset off because she was so scared by it. And it's that physical reaction to it. It's a completely different experience. And I think the first film footage that was ever shown, I think it was back in the 1890s, the path they did of the train coming into the station. The viewers in the cinema screen, in the cinema theatre dived out the way because they thought that the train was going to come towards them. And it feels like virtual reality, and that was something that was brand new. Virtual reality, it's a brand new experience, and it's a completely different reaction that you have to it.
I think the economics are also in virtual reality's favor in a way as well. I mean, 3D TV really required a significant investment on the part of consumers to go out and buy a 3D TV set that oftentimes was in excess of thousands of dollars. The key to VR is already in most of our pockets, right? Our mobile phones are a great path into the medium. And obviously, you can scale all the way up to a high-end headset. But, I mean, cardboard is a very inexpensive and easily distributable way of getting a taste of how this, to your point, changes the story. And I think you just need to give consumers that little insight, and they come back for more.
And I want to get into kind of the storytelling aspect of virtual reality, because I keep hearing from you guys this idea of empathy and kind of humanizing these stories. And before we get into some of the examples that you guys have brought, I mean, what can shooting a story in VR, what can virtual reality do that traditional 2D digital video can't do?
I personally think that it can create so much of a deeper feeling of connection and intimacy with either a topic or a person. A lot about creating storytelling for something like film is just understanding what's happening. In VR, it's so much more of a visceral reaction. And and maybe just to get a sense, how many of you guys have tried VR so far? Oh, nice. Incredible. Probably compared to last year, it's completely different. So even if you're in VR and something's coming at you, you know that it's fake, but your body reacts to it.
Yeah.
So that combination of understanding something, but actually feeling it with your body and being emotionally compelled could have the potential to shift you, to connect you, to make you understand something like we do in the world, which was with our whole selves.
Jason, how would you say using VR in the news world, I mean, how does that enhance a news story, and what goes into the decision of, okay, let's shoot this in VR, this is one that would be good for VR?
Right, I think it's a combination of what Yelena just articulated about the human aspect and that connection that you feel because you do feel like you're there. And there's also a visual component too, right? I mean, I think that we encourage our producers, many of whom are very new to using VR and are being challenged to sort of take this equipment out into the field, in addition to everything else that they're doing, particularly in breaking news situations. But I encourage them also to find environments that are compelling, that you want to travel to, that have a visual aspect to them, that also have movement in 360 in a way as well. I mean, I think 360 still photography is really interesting, but for our purposes, we want there to be some sort of action that is compelling you to sort of look all around and explore this space. So I think that there's an aesthetic component and an emotional component that have to be hand in hand in order to really leverage 360. And I say often that to our producers who are curious about the medium, that probably 10% of the things that they're working on actually make sense in VR. Then the rest of the 90%, it's actually potentially better told using traditional fixed frame video, because that's still a very effective medium.
Can you give the audience like some examples of stuff that CNN has done in VR that work?
Sure. I mean, I think our first piece from a breaking news event was in the days after the Paris attacks, and we did a piece from the memorial that sort of cropped up ad hoc at the Place de République, excuse me. And it was a beautiful piece, and I think that the entire world was mourning, and you felt like you could transport yourself to the central point of the sadness of that story. So that's just one example of, again, the aesthetics were there. It was sort of a circular environment, and the emotional component was there as well.
And Neil, how do you guys decide what stories to take on? Which ones would be good for VR? What are you guys experimenting with?
It really depends on which genre we're looking at. To begin with, we looked at, a couple of the pieces in there were sports pieces of content, and two of them were F1 and Team Sky cycling. When we were looking at Team Sky, Team Sky was starting their preparations for the Tour de France as we started working on virtual reality. And there were two main reasons for looking at doing a documentary following Team Sky on their road to the Tour de France. One is that I think it's quite easy to see the Tour de France once a year and see them out on the road and think, oh, that's it's an incredible human effort. But the precision it takes to get a team together to put them in a position where they could be contenders for the Tour de France, and the amount of grueling effort it takes for the riders, we wanted to put the viewers closer to that experience and really try and make them feel, give them an experience of what it's like to be on the road with the riders. And at the same time, Team Sky are all about innovation. And so everything that we were doing internally in the virtual reality studio, we actually spoke to Team Sky and looked at how they analysed every single aspect of what they're doing. And because so much goes into the actual production of virtual reality, we had to analyse every single part of the pipeline and work out exactly how we put it together. So both of there was a nice synergy there. But with Team Sky, it was really just trying to give the viewers a feeling of what it took to get that far. And apart from anything else, we wanted to challenge ourselves, because it's actually quite difficult to film cycling and get up close to cyclists. So we wanted to see if we could make a lot of these camera positions work. And I think a year ago, I went to a few virtual reality conferences where we were told about the rules of shooting VR, and it was, you must keep the camera still, no motion. You have to have certain distances around the cameras. And so we used that as a bit of a test bed to see what would work. And there was drone footage in there and footage on floating cameras out in front of them. So it was a combination of things for Team Sky.
What was the reaction? People liked?
Yeah, the reaction to that's been really good. I think particularly the cycling shots on the road where you're in and amongst the pack and you can see their faces a bit more closely. You can see the amount of effort that goes into it. So it's gone down really well.
Alan, I'd be interested to know what shows at BBC are you guys experimenting? I'm assuming VR doesn't work on everything, but there are certain shows that maybe there are better experiences for. So which ones are you guys working on?
Yeah, I think a lot of the points that have been made apply to us in exactly the same way. It's very much about finding the reason you do it within a particular genre. And broadly speaking, I think we tend to look for one of probably three things. One, are we changing your perspective on an event? Is somehow what you're experiencing changing the way that you perceive it? And that might well be in an emotional context. And it might well be that actually you get a first-hand account that you otherwise couldn't experience. But at the same time, I think we have to be cognizant of the fact that sometimes it can simply be a pleasurable experience. So it's really important within perhaps an entertainment context that what it might do is offer you a bit of a peek behind the curtain to a place that you might not normally be able to travel, which feels equally important. I also think in a sports context, in terms of being able to put you in a seat or a position that you cannot normally occupy, whether that's actually on the pitch at a football match, you sort of feel, well, that is taking me to a place I can't otherwise experience. So we look for those three things, and we've done it across a range of content. So we've tried things like Trooping the Colour, which people will probably know. We've done the Olympics in a factual context. We've looked at the Easter Rising. We've also done a thing called We Wait, which is about a refugee and that first-hand account of how that feels. Because I think tone is actually one of the things that's most difficult to get right. I think tonally, how do you land these experiences in the correct way so that you don't devalue what's happening, that you don't in some way minimize it?
You mentioned to me this idea of when you're looking at a VR film, kind of interactive storytelling, and the decisions you make that might be a little bit different than when you're producing a different type of film.
Yeah, no, I think about, I think we're using a lot of the same language from film and trying to transfer it over into VR, and I think that's where the challenge comes. Even the word storytelling can be challenging because when we think of storytelling for a film, it's very constructed, whereas when you're creating for VR, you have to really think about giving the audience freedom to either look around or to move around, so you don't have control over it. So you're not really storytelling, you're story experiencing. And I like to think of it as really taking someone on a journey without knowing exactly where they're going to look and having to kind of design for the human. A lot of it is really just human-centered design. So a lot of times I recommend having a user experience designer, someone who understands what motivates people to look in a place, what makes someone want to touch out and reach something else. Because a lot of this we actually already know about ourselves as far as perception. As filmmakers, you don't, because think about a director. A director in film is just about ultimate control. A director in VR shouldn't be that. I think that's the wrong way to do it because it's going to feel constrained. The best VR experience is when you actually feel like an active participant in it somehow. And I really loved, what you meant of giving someone a perspective of something that they can experience. And I was talking to Jason about it, but a great experience in VR is also making the invisible visible, which you did with the David Attenborough piece, which I really liked, which is when he was talking about dinosaurs, and he was talking about it, and then you see the huge dinosaur kind of go above you and climb over you, and your understanding of what he's talking about is so much more greatly increased. And then he talks about the bones of the dinosaur, and then the dinosaur becomes see-through, and you see all of the bones that are kind of in there. And mixing animation with live action can actually take you a lot farther, because you can even feel what it feels like to be inside of someone's head. There's this, it's really hard to do comedy in VR right now, because just, random jokes don't seem to work. You can't do fast cuts. But there's this one piece with Reggie Watts called Waves that I thought was one of the first pieces that I actually laughed out loud, because I felt like, I don't know how many of you know Reggie Watts, but he's just a really kooky character. And I felt like I was inside of his wacky head, and it was funny. And you can't do that, with live action, and you can't really do that in 2D, because I felt like I was immersed in it. So I think the example we have here is called Notes on Blindness. Should we show it and then I'll talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, sure. Do you want to give a quick, just so people know what they're looking at?
Oh, sure. So this is a VR experience that is available for free on the Oculus store. And it's one of my favorite pieces and just feels like it works natively to VR and to 360. And it's the story of John Hall, who was a writer and theologian. And over the course of a few decades, he was going blind. And in order for him to make sense of the experience, he started recording his voice on audio cassettes. And there was a documentary also, and the VR experience is different. So this is a VR experience of you actually being in the perspective of John Hall and starting to understand what it could feel like to be blind. Yeah, so it's so subtle where it's, it's 6 episodes. The first episode is just him sitting in a park and talking about the sounds of a park where we as seeing people take it for granted. But how does a blind person see? So the footsteps that walk around, the bird that flies over, and that works so well in VR because it feels like you're there, and everyday life is just subtle in the little details that bring us there. It uses spatial sound, which I think is a really key component in VR. Sound, I know they say is 50% of film, but I think it's even more so in VR, which has you look in various directions and makes you feel like you're actually in a physical space. And because you're hearing his voice, it feels like the voice is in your head. And the visuals are so slight and leaves room for the imagination that even though you're seeing something, you still get the sense that you're seeing what it feels like and to be blind. And almost everyone who watches it comes out with what feels like a broader perspective. And it has slight interactivity. That's always a challenge, interactivity and storytelling, and I think it's been very challenging to try to get it right. But it uses eye gaze, where when you look at certain objects in some of the episodes, they activate or look up, or you hear what the vibration of like rain would be like on a plate if you're looking at the plate. So it's all these little things. And the thing that I like to talk about a lot as well is leaving room for the imagination in VR, because I think VR is such sensory overload so often that it takes us away, but the most active thing about us is our imagination. When you're reading a book, you can be more transported than watching a film. So how do you create that space where your imagination's still activated, even though most of your senses are still being utilized? And I think that does a great job.
And I know you mentioned before, some of the limitations or the hard part of VR is you can't control where somebody's looking. So Jason, I guess, how has that changed how you tell a story? How has kind of that aspect of VR and those limitations changed how you put together these VR videos?
So a couple of things on that. One is that I do feel like even though you have the potential for something to be happening in all directions, I think the viewer can sort of be directed to a central focus point in most circumstances. And I think spatial audio is one of the best ways to do that if you have access to that technology. People do a lot of the directing on their own using audio cues. And even for some of the pieces that we've produced where we don't have spatial audio, we try to remember where true north is when the person wakes up inside of the experience, and use subtle visual cues to direct them around the space and help them to identify, if you look behind you, you'll see X, and underneath your feet is Y. So we try not to be like too explicit there, because I think it gets annoying after a while, but I do think there are subtle ways to kind of help the viewer understand what it is that they're supposed to be focusing on. And the other thing, to Yelena's point, like, you don't want to over-direct, and there's nothing wrong with watching a piece twice, so you capture the pieces that you missed. With Notes on Blindness or, Strictly, I would definitely want to see both of those pieces twice to make sure that I didn't miss like a key moment. VR really rewards multiple viewings.
Great. Alan, how are you finding, and I guess Neil too, like how are you finding people are discovering your content, your VR content? Because we say VR like it's this big broad thing, but there's so many different ways. Not everyone owns an Oculus headset. So how are people finding your content?
I mean, we are absolutely in an early stage where we're asking lots of questions. So we have a site called BBC Taster, where we put a lot of this content out. People can consume it and tell us what they think, and that's really crucial for us. At this, right now, we need to know what people think about this. So we're doing it in a very gentle way. I certainly don't feel we're as far down the road as you are. So you may have a different interface.
Well, at the moment, our content is on Facebook 360 and YouTube 360 and on the Oculus menus of Facebook 360, so you can view it in a headset. But we are going to be launching a Sky VR app in the next couple of months, which will be across all the platforms, so Google Cardboard, Oculus Rift, Samsung Gear, which is really important for us, both to have a destination for our content where viewers can go and watch it the way that we want it to be watched, rather than just on the 360 platforms. But it will also allow us to push the uses of interactivity forward and to start to get feedback from viewers on what they enjoyed about the uses of VR, what worked, what didn't. It's interesting you're talking about being able to direct viewers, because, as you say, there are lots and lots of ways that you can, as a director, guide viewers to the point at which you've envisioned to begin with. But there's the possibility to start to get feedback on where viewers are actually looking within the 360 field, which is an incredible tool for directors, so that you know if they were looking at what you intended as a filmmaker, or if actually there's something that's more interesting in the scene. And I imagine for advertisers at some point as well, that'll be compelling for them if they can tell that you're looking at that branded bottle of water at some point in the scene.
There are a ton of questions coming in, so I just want to bring in one or two, because a lot of people, I wanted to ask this question too. What are the commissioning opportunities for producers that exist at Sky? And just kind of maybe generalizing that, will you guys start commissioning VR content?
So yeah, so now that our strategy was to get to a certain stage with production in-house that we felt like we had good feedback on what worked, what didn't work in each genre. And also so that we knew and fully understood how VR should be produced. So we are now commissioning content. We just announced that a couple of weeks ago. And really it's a very broad remit at the moment. Fundamentally, why should this story be told in VR, whether it's documentary or narrative? But we really want to get the content producers out there helping us and helping the industry as a whole to push the boundaries of VR, to move forward and to help crack comedy, to help crack drama, to help us, crack how we cover more sports than we've been doing already. So we're going to be commissioning 12 VR films or so over the next 2 or 3 years. And when I say films, we're looking at between around 5 to 20 minutes at the moment. That's rather than 2-hour feature films.
What does the best for you guys? I mean, when you look at going to commission content, is there anything that kind of sticks out that does really well?
Well, at the moment, it's such early stages that we don't have feedback on exactly what's working. Fundamentally, when viewers go into a Sky VR app, we would like them to see content that they would expect from Sky, but also that adds something new through VR, so whether that's a sense of presence or greater sense of emotional connection or empathy. And interactivity is going to be a huge part of it. So the range of ideas in VR is just so huge at the moment. We're not limiting it to just saying in the arts we're looking for music and ballet, or in dramatic content we're just looking for film studio related content or anything. It's very broad at the moment, and part of the exercise of setting up a VR studio has meant that we've been able to get out there and start to have conversations with the likes of Oculus, the likes of BBC, with a lot of boutique VR companies in the UK and abroad. So it's very broad at the moment. We're still at the very early stages.
How about the BBC? I think I read something about...
Yeah, so, I think that the absolute honest answer to, are we in a position where we're commissioning VR content as a normalised part of the process? We're not at that point yet. And I think probably all broadcasters are really not quite at that, or certainly all traditional broadcasters are not really at that point yet. But, we've done those pieces that we have done with different partners and around content where we wanted to ask key questions of the audience. I think the interesting question for us is, what do the audience feel about this? How are they going to consume it? Are they going to consume it in sufficient numbers to justify its place as we go forward? And that will inform the role that it has in terms of the commissions that we make. It's absolutely not impossible that someone can come through the door and pitch us a piece of VR content. That's happening, and that's certainly happening around BBC Three. We've had some people come to the table with pieces. I think it's just very difficult for us to know, in all honesty at the moment, where our audience stand on this. I think it's incumbent on broadcasters to be the best representative of their audience that they can be, and make sure that they're, and certainly for a public service broadcaster, providing the best content. So we're not at that stage yet. Who knows where we'll get to. I do think there's an interesting question about whether there is a tipping point for VR. Is there a piece of content, is there something which happens that just kind of tips it? If you look at Microsoft when they launched Xbox, it's really Halo that drove the success of Xbox. So I just ask myself, if there's some piece of content that is going to make this explode, then I think the answer to do we commission this content will be very different.
We just saw the popularity of Pokemon Go and what that said about augmented reality, and that was just this eye-opening moment. I don't know if any of you guys play Pokemon Go, but if you go to like Central Park in New York, there are just hordes of people holding up their phones, and you're like, oh my God, this is something real. I've never seen technology make people act kind of like this. It's such an interesting moment. Do you think we're going to have that moment for VR? We've seen so many cool examples and so many fascinating ways it's being used. But the bottom line is, I'm not walking around and seeing people on these headsets, or we're beginning to see it come in our Facebook feed a little bit. I mean, is there going to be that moment, or what do you think could be that killer application?
Yeah, and I completely agree. And similar to how you think about the history of film, it took great pivotal films to continue increasing the craft and showing that film was an art form. And it's great that there's the BBC and there's National Film Board of Canada, and there's a bunch of public funding going towards just the experimentation of figuring out what that is. And just also to your previous question of the US, it's a little bit more challenging because there's much less access to public funds. And so Oculus is helping to seed the landscape with some funding, just because we know that we need to help push that forward. So it's not all just branded advertising. But definitely, I think, we talked about earlier how when you try on VR on someone, people just, their eyes kind of sparkle and they're so excited. And it's been a convergence of industries that are starting to work in it. So you have a bunch of creatives pivoting their lives to just focus on VR, a bunch of technology companies pivoting their companies to focus on VR, a bunch of financial industries pivoting. So that kind of convergence of all these industries focusing on what the next killer thing is going to be, whether it's science, education, sports, something we don't even know about. It's kind of, I personally think it's inevitable that something's going to come that's going to be kind of a zeitgeist shift.
What do you think, Jason? I mean, what do you think has to happen to, I mean, it's funny because Jason's office is like a little bit like a startup if you go into CNN. I keep saying this, but like he has like gear everywhere and it's very like startup-y. It's not something you would expect in like a newsroom. But it certainly seems like we need a couple people who are just throwing things against a wall to see if they stick.
Well, I think actually that gets to one of the reasons why I think VR hasn't totally had that breakout moment yet, is because of all the weird hardware in my office. The hardware is like a little nerdy still, you know what I mean? Like it just looks kind of nerdy to have this big mask on your head. And I think that there are real fundamental questions to ask about, the social aspects of VR. I think, as immersive as it is, it's also sort of isolating. That's the other side of it. And so I think that we're quickly on the way to getting there. I think that the interest in VR is super high, the funding is super high, and it's a matter of converting individuals rather than having this moment where suddenly everybody turns on and tomorrow they're all using VR. But one at a time, I think that people become very appreciative of the medium, and if we can as the hardware sort of begins to develop in a place where it's not as clunky or, maybe involves, again, like augmented reality, a blend of the real world and the digital, I think you're going to be able to see a lot higher adoption rates in the future.
And I would love, before we move on, just to show, it's funny, last night Jason was on his phone and looking and trying to approve a video because the earthquake in Italy happened and there was the idea, right, to try to shoot this in VR.
Virtual reality, when consumed the right way, with a headset, brings you really close to that space and can bring you really close to the characters who are experiencing that in a way that 2D I just don't think can possibly rival or fixed frame can rival. So we are trying to get there and get this experience out while the audience is already engaged with the emotional component of the story. And so being able to send a journalist there on Tuesday night and then post this quickly, which anyone who works in VR knows that is a challenge. Like the post-production part of VR is the hard part of VR. And so we are really working on our speed because people, I think, are relying on us for breaking news. And this is the kind of story they want to connect with now.
And this goes into my next question. An audience member also asked, how different is training a crew for VR production versus traditional shooting? So maybe if any of you guys could answer that. But Jason, even now that we're kind of specifically looking at this, like what production went into this? Like what equipment did they have in the field?
Luckily, we have an amazing sort of dedicated VR journalist at our London bureau, a guy by the name of Lewis Wild, who was willing to hop on a flight and go do this because he just felt that it was an important story to tell. But we are slowly teaching all of our news gathering crews to do this. And the equipment we used is, if any of you are familiar with VR rigs, it's a GoPro Freedom 360 rig, which means it's 6 GoPros snapped into a 3D printed array, so that it's shooting in all directions. But then, of course, the hard part is taking the footage from those 6 GoPros, creating hopefully a seamless stitch of video. And then from a remote region like that that's just suffered an earthquake, how do you get that footage out digitally? It's a huge file. So there's a couple of tripwires in terms of getting this shot and post-produced and then transmitted back home. We actually, one of the first VR pieces we produced was last year on the beach in Lesbos where the Syrian refugees were landing. It's a very effective piece because you could, not only were you seeing the reporter guide you to where the refugees were landing, but as he was reporting, you saw them get out of the dinghy, walk up over the crest of the beach, and you just, as you're watching them walking around, you're thinking, wow, not only have they just had this horrific journey coming over, but they don't know what they're just walking up there to go and see. And a really, really effective piece of VR, but it took, I think, about 3 weeks to turn around at that point because we didn't have all the tools. And you were asking before, what will it take to really push it forward? It's absolutely the hardware has to become easier to use and more comfortable to use, but the content creation tools, they've come so far in the last year, but I imagine that was probably an incredibly tricky job to turn around that quickly. It's amazing to do that. But there's a news company called Riot in the States who produce a lot of good news stories and documentaries. And I was chatting to a couple of the heads over there a few months ago, and they were saying that in 2014 and 2015, no one in their company slept because they basically just 24-hour post-production cycle.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I really agree with all of that. I don't think the barriers will be at the delivery end or even the capture end, because actually in some ways the capture is quite simple. I think that point about how self-conscious users feel is absolutely critical. It feels in a way, just to say in terms of that content, I think in an era where there is so much news, it's very easy to develop fatigue about certain images and certain stories, and perhaps it's not that you don't engage properly with them, but you perhaps don't realise the enormity of it because you see it with reasonable regularity. But when you see something like that in that context, it changes that. That's an experience that I think becomes quite singular to VR. It draws you to that story and gives you a different perspective. But I think that broader point about how self-conscious and how clunky you feel, is there a sort of I'm BBC, I shouldn't do any brands, but is there an iPhone moment that revolutionises the way people want to consume this because they're prepared to engage with that device? I think that will be the key question.
And really quick, because we have a lot of questions coming in, and I know a lot of folks want to ask questions. Really quick and short, I mean, what's your expectation for VR in your industry? I know it'll probably be different for you and Oculus and BBC. I mean, what does this look like 5-10 years down the road? How much of our time are we going to spend in a virtual world?
I genuinely think that is very difficult to answer, and that's not about avoiding the question. I'm Scottish, we're absolutely happy to rush towards the question. It's genuinely, I think it's really difficult to answer because it's those 2 points for me. Where technology and content innovation tend to have succeeded, the audience tend to be predisposed to it. So, for example, for us, the success of iPlayer, I think, is brilliantly timed with the proliferation of technology, which makes it incredibly easy and comfortable to view that wherever you are. So the question for me is twofold. Will there be this moment in the evolution of the technology which makes you much less self-conscious and is the equivalent of an iPhone moment? And two, will there be that Pokemon Go moment where everyone wants to be part of it and that drives uptake to such an extent that it becomes normalised? And I honestly think that's difficult to answer right now.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's inevitable that technology is in this very, very, if I even think about 2 years ago, it's impossible to even think where we are now. So I think of VR as dog years, or 1 year in VR is like 7 years in real life. So like 10 years from now, it's going to be 70 years from now. It's really hard to tell, but technology is moving so rapidly, and it's getting smaller, and it's getting cheaper, and it's getting faster, and it's getting prettier. So that on top of all the content creators that are working on it, and it's also going to become much more social. I mean, Facebook bought Oculus because it sees it as a potential to connect us more deeply, and there's a lot of teams working on socializing VR experiences and bringing people together from far away. So I don't know exactly what it's going to look like, what the Pokemon Go app is going to, and I also just don't see Pokemon Go as something that has lasting power necessarily. But in one way or another, in whatever form it takes, it's going to be a part of the world that we live in.
Yeah, I'm loath to make a prediction as well because I am afraid of listening to myself 5 years from now about how wrong I was. But I think that there's like a sort of a utopian and a dystopian future for VR. Like in the utopian future, like it's an incredible medium that makes us reconnect with journalism, at least in my case, and it makes us reconnect with all different kinds of creative products. And we spend a lot of time looking at screens, and this is a screen that has no end, and so I think, in the way that it reinvigorates that experience, there's like a great opportunity in the future. The downside of that, of course, is the possibility that like we spend a lot of time in VR, and like what does, going way out, like what does the future of humanity look like? If we spend as much time locked in a virtual world or in an augmented world as we currently do on our cell phones, which is already a very isolating technology. So I think there are upsides, I think there are downsides. And of course, there's a third option where like VR, we're asking hype or, fad or whatever. I mean, it's possible that the technology like doesn't become a mainstream item. I think that that's still one other path. And, we'll look back on this and be like, that was, that was an interesting chat.
Remember when your office looked like a startup?
Yeah, exactly. So,
Now we're back to
so I
that.
think, all right, good. So 5 years from now, I'll look back and at least know I kept those 3 options open.
Right.
One of those has to be
Okay,
right. So
great.
Good.
Really quick,
future
because I
self,
definitely
so.
want to ask the audience. I want the audience to be able to ask questions.
I agree with everything that's just been said there. I think one thing that could push it forward even faster is that VR and AR has the potential to be the future of computing, not just the future of content creation. And I've done some incredible AR demos where you're in a headset and you can manipulate screens like Minority Report. And as soon as that becomes the future of computing, and computers aren't limited to your rectangular laptop, the devices that you would use to do that computing, if you can interact with content, have that sense of presence in content, flick between the two. Look what mobiles and iPads have done to the way you consume content. I feel like that will really help drive it forward. But creating the content is so important, I think, getting together, because there's definitely something unique, surprising, and new there.
Perfect. I want to open it to the audience, too. I know we have mics, but do you want, yeah, go ahead. And then I'll read some of the questions on here, because we've got a couple on here.
I think you make a really good point there at the end. It's almost like the storytelling has to be a given. But it seems to me that the technology is where it becomes something that makes it useful. So imagine a world where there are no screens and it's all VR. And that is the interface and the user experience between the individual who's actually doing the experiencing and the way that you access the experience. So now there is no screen, it's all done in this virtual world. And I think the HoloLens, the Microsoft version of what it is maybe coming closer to that. And it also is a little less geeky. I mean, can you expend a little bit more time on that? Because I think that's a really important thing.
It's very difficult to know exactly where that's going to take us. I think the worlds that you can exist in within stories or within sports or anything, I think the fact that there'll become a point where hopefully you can seamlessly exist in those worlds, and the content that you're creating will interact more seamlessly with you. I think there's also a broader question of where AI comes into it, and how stories can be reactive. That's quite far in the future, but I think storytelling fundamentally I don't think storytelling needs to fundamentally change. I think people will still want to consume stories in whatever environment they're in, and actually, even within an environment where you're in a 360 environment and a story is going on around you, you can still have although 360 in VR doesn't have a frame to it, you can still use frames to help tell your story, and you can have 2D frames within the experience. So, I mean, I think there's so many tools that are yet completely unexplored that will help move it forward. But certainly, I think so much more needs to be done on the HoloLens side as to how you can interact with it. And actually, that's one of the additional reasons to get involved with producing VR content, is to work out how that then transforms and moves over into AR. I don't know if any of you have got any more.
I want to be able to get to just a couple more, if you guys don't mind, because I think this one up here is good and has wants some numbers. So it says everyone can watch 360 video with or without cardboard, but is this entry VR compelling, and is there data showing users watching it?
Yeah, no, I think that brings up a good question of just about the different platforms. Facebook 360 just has the potential of the most eyeballs. You know, Game of Thrones intro had like 12 million, 13 million views. But you experience it much differently, where when you experience something on your phone or the news feed, you kind of do it quickly, you're doing something else, and you're not blocked off from the world. When you're experiencing something in VR, it's a much more intimate experience. Gear VR is more immersive than Facebook 360, but it's still limiting in that when you move the world with you. And then in the Rift, which has a sensor that sees where your headset is, and soon the touch controllers that sees where your hands are, when you physically walk, you walk in the virtual world and can interact with the virtual world too, and can potentially be much more compelling. So you can definitely have a unique experience on 360, and people are watching it, and there's tens of millions of viewers on it, but you'll have a much more intimate experience on the other ones.
Is that kind of the beginning opportunity for CNN, the 360 video? Is that how most people are discovering?
Yeah, I mean, to Yelena's point, I mean, the 360 video platforms are enormous, so it's a great way to encourage, you know, our viewers to look at it, and it's also a great way to encourage, honestly, our content creators inside the company to make stuff, because they see, oh wow, that got 2 million views, that got 3 million views, that was a really popular piece of content. But of course, you know, when we're producing this stuff, we're producing it with the headset experience in mind. There's, just as one little tiny example of how we're doing that, there's a lot of cameras on the market which are, you know, 2-lens cameras, like the Ricoh Theta, or, you know, these are sort of little consumer-based cameras that technically shoot in 360, but the quality level isn't there to view it on a high-end headset. I don't let any of our crews use that camera, because even though a tiny portion of the audience is going to see it on a headset, I want that to be the rich experience that they walk away with and think of CNN when they think of high-end VR.
Great. Anything else? Okay, really quick, and then we gotta wrap it up. Go ahead.
Are you guys noticing any fatigue Are you guys noticing any fatigue because I mean, there was this huge boost of enthusiasm and excitement, and we saw like the top 10 most watched VR videos on Facebook and things like that, and they were really impressive, but they are still somewhat passive. I mean, there is this wow factor, but now are you noticing that we have to kind of push the boundaries a little bit more in order to stay relevant and to stay meaningful?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think it's a very important time to show, after everyone's done their first experiences, that how are we continuing to elevate the craft, which is what we talked about, experimentation with what the BBC's doing, with a lot of the public funding, with Oculus seeding more of the creative space that's not branded. Google's doing the same thing. So it's an important time for all you content creators to show us where it can go.
I think that's a pivotal question, actually, because in fact, it was just yesterday or the day before, I was looking at content with someone who'd created an experience where people sort of surprise you by just suddenly they're just there. And of course, that was great for 30, 40 seconds. Then the question immediately becomes, well, what are you going to do with this then? And actually, of course, in the gaming context, you can see precisely how that would work and would be incredibly unsettling, actually. But I think that's always the question, and it's the logical next step. There is a moment required where, exactly as you say, everyone has become, they've seen it, so they've seen the treat. Now, what are you going to do with it? And it's got to take that leap in terms of storytelling and imagination that I think drives people to consume it.
Last question, and then I want to end on the latest Oculus kind of video, or commission video. But What makes a fictional story suitable for VR?
We're gonna have to, it's going to take a
Give
long
it to
time.
me in like 30 seconds.
Oh,
It's just such a good question. We have to ask it.
a fictional story. We're such at the beginning of understanding what works, but a big thing is authenticity. Acting feels much more phony in VR. So TV acting and theater acting don't quite fit, so it's a different type of acting for the camera that we still need to learn more about and what that looks like. But as far as a type of fictional story, I think any kind of fictional story works. You have to think about what's the heart of the story, what are the experience you want to tell the audience, and then you build knowing the tools we already know from that. So I don't think there's one type that works or doesn't work.
Wonderful. Well, I think we're out of time, so if you guys have any other questions we didn't get to them, I'm sure you guys will hang out for a little bit. But thank you guys so much for coming. Appreciate it.